Welcome, everyone. I have the pleasure of welcoming you to Sustainability Data Hell, if you've read the program. But damnation aside, we expect a very interesting conversation. I'm Peter Temis. I'm the founder and president of the Institute for Innovation in Large Organizations. We are known as ILO. We also run the ILO Decarbonization Strategy Community. And we're here with a wonderful set of folks. We've got Japan from SAP, Brian from PwC, Christian from SAP, and me. And I think the first order of business is introductions. Please.
Thanks for coming. Can you hear me in the back? Don't have to use a drill sergeant voice. There we go. Great, thanks. I'm Japan Hollist. I have the privilege of being the head of our sustainability go-to-market activities at SAP. I work in customer advisory in North America. I think we're going to comment kind of on our kind of what brought us here. Should I do that?
Please do.
Okay. I was a young infantry officer when Bush pushed for a surge in Iraq, and I got assigned to drill sergeant duty and running basic training and for a couple of years, and I read an article on sustainability and it captivated me, and I thought that was the mega trend that I wanted to connect my career to as I got out of the Army. And so I come from a very, very conservative background into climate interests and the environment, which is a very different route than most. But it was a fantastic route for me. And it's made an enormous difference in my career. And so that's my background and why I came to sustainability. Brian.
Thanks, Japan. Brian Henry. With PwC, my area of responsibility is around working very closely with technical alliances with a focus on how clients can use technology to help advance their sustainability journeys. Believe a lot of the answers that we're looking for at some point can be found in data, and the systems that we use to collect and process and report that data are going to be critical to our success. How did I come to sustainability? Started out my career in oil and gas, not surprisingly, in our energy industry, which is much maligned, but which we all need so dearly. We see that an environment under transition, the energy transition, is pretty critical. But the more I worked in that environment, the more I realized how much more we needed to do at scale to be successful. Ultimately found myself to PwC, where I'm working with a lot of very talented, highly motivated people to assist our clients to get to where they need to go. And so it's great to be with you. Seeing a lot more younger faces we're looking at than maybe the ones you're looking at, and that's excellent. That needs to happen, and we look forward to a great discussion.
Thank you. Hi. Does that work? Yeah. So Christian Butzlaff, also with SAP. I'm a solution architect for sustainability for North America. I'm a physicist by training. When I went to college, right, I was more like in bio and organic chemistry. But we also had the first data center there doing like really the first climate simulation models there in Hamburg. So I still remember those days when the first climate change was really predicted there. So now within SAP, I had multiple roles in engineering. Then I went more customer facing, and then since almost like 4 years, I'm working the sustainability space. What got me there? To be honest, in 2020, those who are here from the Bay Area might remember the CZU fire, which basically burned 90,000 acres all the way from Skyline to the coast. And I was hiking that area like a week before the fire started. And that really got me thinking, right? And then I thought I want to do something which is really more meaningful. So I moved into the sustainability space within SAP. Thanks.
Hello. Awesome. Wonderful. And we did just have a pretty terrific pre-game conversation. If you're a Yankees fan, by the way, pre-game is kind of good. The World Series officially started yesterday. I think New York's looking good, but we'll have that conversation separately. Yeah, nothing like watching the World Series at a bar at the Marriott Residence Inn, but that's a whole other story. So we've got a few points that we want to cover. I'm going to ask these gentlemen some specific questions. They've got a lot to say. My job is also to push them a little bit so that we talk about data, practices, processes, tools, but we talk about the underlying issues that the data represents. We talk about changes that have to happen in order for us to get where all of our organizations want and need to go. So that's kind of my role. But the next slide has a QR code on it. Those of you already talking on your phones have an advantage. But if you have a device with you, pull it out, please, and scan that code. You're going to be asked about what degree, or if we want to follow Dante, what circle of data hell you're in. Thank you to the English and Italian majors. I'm not going to quote the Inferno in Italian, but I can. So who's in sustainability data hell right now, to what degree? When you click on that, you'll see you have a button option. Choose the option that describes you best. Thriving, I have a solid data strategy in place. Steady, on track. Moderate, facing some challenges. Challenged, struggling with inconsistencies. Or overwhelmed, I am seriously struggling to pull data from multiple sources. And I'd add, if you're in the category of we don't do it at all, I would say choose overwhelmed. Once you click the button, you'll be asked to sign up for a third-party service. Don't do that. Just shut it down and we'll be fine. I think we can go to the next slide. Has everybody got it, if you're going to get it? Okay, why don't we do that? Oh, look at that. The consensus is challenged. Not, I think, a shock. So we have a lot of work to do. I'm going to begin with a question to Japan. After we do the round of questions, by the way, we will open this up to questions from the floor and to some discussion before we conclude. So Japan, why does data matter so much for sustainability? And why is it reaching a feeling of criticality for some, even though most people feel challenged?
Yeah, great question. So, you've heard the sayings that data is the new oil. You've heard the sayings that it's the lifeblood of organizations, and we certainly see that, particularly in an AI-driven economy. If you don't have good data, how many here have used ChatGPT? 4? Anybody? People on 4? Yeah, everybody, right? Everybody's using it, right? I'm amazed. I've got a son who is just finished his freshman year into his sophomore year in college, and to watch him use data in ways that I never thought possible as a freshman. He's so much faster, so much more effective, made the dean's list. Like, a freshman year, how do you do that? I didn't do that. So I think data is just revolutionizing our world, and it is key for sustainability. We talk about it as sustainability is all about data, data, data. But that data has attributes, right? And we talk about it. It needs to have the 5 A's, right? It needs to be automated. You want it to come in automated ways. You want it to be accurate. You want it to be assured. You want it to be auditable. And then you need that data, as we see this data trend for sustainability, you need it to be attestable, meaning the CFO in your organization is going to need to sign off on the E, S, and G data just like they do on the financial data. And so now when do you want the data? Well, you want it at period close intervals, right? It used to take, when I was a practitioner in sustainability in a Fortune 200 insurance company, it would take us 15 months to gather 12 months of data, right? In today's world, at the rate at which regulations are impacting us, at the speed at which they are impacting us, that is insufficient. It does not work. You must have that data at a far faster clip, and it's got to be synced back into who's starting to control it, right? I see CFOs hiring ESG controllers that sit right next to their financial controllers, and they're accountants, right, with a sustainability interest and background. So, when I started, I was working with our senior vice president for corporate communications. And that was where sustainability began. It began as a good news story, a PR play to drive brand improvement and recognition for all the good things that our company was doing. That is no longer the case, right? PR is very, very different than finance. Very different, right? The rules are different. And so the rules around data are different. And I think with that as the backdrop, I think we begin our conversation on how do you solve the data problem, right? Hopefully that's helpful.
I think that is helpful. I want to give you one quick follow-up. How should we be thinking about the underlying issues that the data collection is pointing to? Which is to say, we've got moving targets in terms of what sustainability really is. My concern is we're going to dial in and have a lot of investment in systems that give us the kinds of data we're looking for, and then fundamental shifts happen, and the more important data is not in that collection. How do we have that generative notion of collecting sustainability data?
No, it's a great point. We talk about it, and it may be a little bit marketing or too much marketing, but I think about it in terms of I need to record, right, the data so that I can report the data. That seems to be the compelling event, right? Everybody says, get me my report, right? Give me my CSRD report, give me my CDP report, give me my TS, right? Just name the 3 to 4 letter acronym, and there's a report at the end of it. So record so that you can report, but what people forget is, and there's all kinds of problems in that data collection. Where is that data? And I think that's what you're alluding to, is where is that data? How do I get it? And where we find is that sometimes you don't have it because you don't have a business process that surrounds it. Right? And that's part of the problem, is that many companies don't do that. And the other problem is that they tend, because I've got to record and report, the focus becomes on the reporting, and so and because it's so painful to gather the data, you end up wanting to gather it all as a sustainability team and put it over in a silo. Problem. Right? When sustainability gets divorced and siloed and separate from the business, it can't influence the business anymore. And what are we trying to do? We're trying to change the business. Right? And I think that's the problem. So it becomes very hard to do the next step in the journey, which is to act. You've done the first start, right, which the regulatory agencies require you to do, and that's report. But you're not ready to act, and you can't go influence that business that's operating unsustainably as they always have, and you're trying to send them reports and get them to change, and you're going to have problems.
I think that's great. Let's move on to Christian. Christian, how can you overcome in a large firm the challenge of disparate, separate, sometimes contradictory streams of data around sustainability?
So yeah, let me do it once, get a step back and kind of build on what Japan was saying, right, in terms of the data. So ultimately, yes, we have to create a report that becomes more and more, legal requirement. But actually what we really want to do is we want to become a sustainable company, right? So we want to change our business processes to become sustainable. And that I cannot do if I have a yearly report, because things have changed. I mean, things are just changing too fast, right? So I have to really be close to the data from a time perspective, but also from an accuracy perspective, right? So if I buy something, right, if I buy something from a supplier, today I look at, from a financial perspective, I look at who was the supplier, what did I buy, how much did I pay? And I really want to know how much I paid. I don't want to have like an average industry price, right? I want to know exactly how much I paid for that item. Now, from a sustainability perspective, I also want to know, for example, what is the carbon footprint associated with that? And I don't necessarily want to have an average carbon footprint. I want to have the exact carbon footprint of that particular purchase. So that will allow me, this insight will allow me then also for future purchases to really drive change, right? Having the procurement manager looking into not only price, quality, availability, but also carbon footprint as an example, and other attributes, right, from the supplier. So we have to be close to the data. It's not about just extracting the data and then creating a report. We have to be close to the data from a time and granular perspective. So that means what we actually would have to do is we have to, first of all, look at where are the data. And quite honestly, a lot of the data are in our ERP systems, right? This is where our business processes run. This is where I do procurement. This is where I do sourcing, where I collaborate with my suppliers. This is where I have my HR processes running, right? When I look into things like equal pay. So sustainability is not carbon, right? It's a broad spectrum of topics. So it's really in the ERP system where I run the business processes and ultimately have the data. So this provides me like a data model, which I need to leverage, where I can define targets and then measure against the targets and take action, right, to become more sustainable. And ultimately, once I have this data model and can bring in all the data, then I can also basically use this to support all kind of regulatory requirements. I have the rigor. Ultimately, I have the same rigor and accuracy assurance, Japan alluded on that, which I need for finance, right? I will also need that for sustainability because we are moving from a voluntary world, right, voluntary reporting world, to a mandatory world, where the CFO has to sign off on it and ultimately might go to jail if it's not correct. So we need to really have the same rigor and sustainability than we have in finance. And once I have these and get these data, then I can create the reporting I need, same then in finance. And I can create all kind of reporting, whether that is CSRD reporting, SEC here, ISSB, BSRS, I think in India, China, the main three stock exchanges just announced or just released their requirements for reporting. So all kind of global and regional requirements. So when we look here, like plastic or packaging, regulations which come up in Oregon and California. So I have all this data I have in my ERP system, and this is what I need to leverage, right? And that's what I need to build on. So that's would be my answer, right, to that. So really kind of collect that.
I think it's a great answer. I want to push a little bit. You're talking about mostly what the data that we're collecting and reporting and doing it well, doing it thoroughly, doing it with a lot of engagement from folks across the organization. Is there another level in which you're talking about principles and values, and you're not looking for answers to questions that the regulatory demands create or that articulated company goals create, but you're looking for new questions. You're looking for how the game has shifted in some way. Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah, I mean, I would say when I understand it correctly, right? So beyond regulation, and a lot of things are driven by regulations, right? Because as a corporation, I want to be compliant. I have to be compliant because I don't want to use fines. But there's also like an advantage, right? If you look at fashion, for instance, fashion industry, right? End consumers want to know where their clothing has been produced, right? They want to, beyond any kind of regulations, they also want to, make sure that there's no child labor, whether there's a law in place or not. People want to look at that, and that is really important for the brands, right? If you look at, there are certain brands, particularly in fashion industry, right, which really build their business model on the assumption that they are sustainable, right? And that's kind of is the whole value of that company. And some of those companies even don't create a sustainability report, right? They just brand themselves as being very sustainable and have huge success with that. So there's a lot of value beyond regulations. For brands and for the end consumer awareness.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've had conversations recently with a very large European-based fashion label, and one of the things that they're beginning to look at in their supply chain is unexpected lower costs, which in theory is great, but they're beginning to see that as an indicator of non-sustainable practices and variation from standards. If suddenly we have a lower cost that's meaningfully lower and unexpected, is there a kind of off-the-grid subcontractor they're pulling in? Do we have the ability to go deeper than just saying, we'll pay the lower price?
Yeah, that is actually an excellent point, right? Because, we can all say, we want to have a sustainable supply chain. We don't want to have forced labor in our supply chain, particularly in that industry, right, where you have multiple layers and so many kind of, third, fifth, sixth tier suppliers. How do you really know that, right? How do you really find that out? So using these kind of data, using AI at the end as well, right? To really find out where are the hotspots where I might want to have to look at, right,
Yeah.
deeper to make sure that I don't have that.
Well, let's continue this. I know Brian is a deep thinker about the things that are not on the surface around sustainability data. So how can you use measures of sustainability, both explicit, consensus-oriented measures, and maybe some of these hard-to-find measures, how do you use them to make really strategic change in large organizations?
Yeah, thanks for throwing me a softball there, Peter. I appreciate that. First of all, as everyone here has said, sustainability at its fundamental core is a data challenge. That's really all it is. The challenge is getting to it. And we've seen, especially in the regulatory environment, as folks have commented on, we're moving from voluntary to mandatory. And some of the requirements are coming thick and fast, I think, with the CSRD. 1,200 metrics probably need to be
1,208.
There you go. And you're looking at the data you need to support those metrics, and to have that assured, we're talking about a massive amount of work. The ISSB also has its own thing going on. We're beginning to see a little bit of convergence around some of those. Maybe some folks in the room have dealt with the CSRD and its requirements. Some of those, the DMA, the double materiality, and the gap analysis, I see some nodding heads and some sleepless nights. The key for corporations is to understand why they're doing sustainability. What's their strategy around sustainability? Is your strategy to merely respond to regulatory requirements and to continue to respond to as minimally as you can to those evolving requirements is the very definition of data hell itself, a purgatory from which you will never emerge. So that shouldn't be the strategy that friends allow friends to adopt. A more sustainable strategy is understanding from that double materiality analysis and from the gap analysis maybe where the largest risks and opportunities are for companies. Because in addition to being a data problem, sustainability is about risk also at its core. Sustainability is a business risk to be assessed and measured and mitigated like any other business risk that we face. Do we have the abilities in our companies to measure sustainability risks in the same way and evaluate those risks in the same way that we evaluate any other business risk? And that's an interesting question, because a lot of the struggles that we are seeing our clients have, and I suspect on that survey, folks didn't pick overwhelmed because no one wants to admit to being overwhelmed. So they picked the one away from overwhelmed. And that's okay. The fact of the matter is, in order to do sustainability right, you need governance. You need the right governance. You need the right attention. You need the right focus. So your C-suite, your board from a oversight perspective, from a governance perspective, from a funding perspective, from driving the right behaviors, needs to be engaged so that other folks in the organization have a chance of being successful at delivering on it. And then for the reporting, critically important, but as has been eloquently described by Japan and by Christian, is the reporting is a snapshot of the past. It's useless for the future. It can't be used as a planning tool. You can't do what-if analyses with a CSRD report that you pulled a crew of 80 people together, spent millions of dollars to compile, and then you report it, but you can't do anything with it around the next transaction, the next set of business. So the key here is to use the sustainability reporting process to actually drive real transformation in the business. We've heard about costs as well and pricing. Is the price of your raw material the true cost of your raw material when you factor in carbon taxes? Is the lowest price supplier the lowest cost supplier? And when do you find that out? 15 months after the fact? And so there's an opportunity here which we'll talk about more. 3 quick examples of things I read recently where folks are actually taking sustainability and making it real. A utility in the UK that is now pinging clients when there's an excess of wind. They're using wind turbines, and they're saying 50% off power for the next 4 hours. It's driving people to then do their washing, their drying, they're charging their EVs, they're doing other energy-dependent tasks. It's actually driving consumption changes. So they're actually saving money. A second one is a cooperative that, in exchange for lower bills, is having clients invest in a little bit of, they're buying a little piece of the turbine. So now individuals who are paying their bills, who are consumers like you and I, actually own a piece of the turbine. And so now are interested in making sure that that continues. And then last but not least, there's the one that really intrigued me, is that you have a builder of sustainable, affordable homes who, when you buy the home, guarantees, which is an all-electric home, you will have no electricity bill for 5 years. Why? Because those homes actually generate more electricity than they use, and so now you have the opportunity to make sustainability real. So on the one side, you have the approach where you can do as minimum as you want and you report the things you have to report and you live in data hell. Go across to the far side, now you've taken sustainability and made it real and fungible. You're saving folks money. You're changing consumption patterns. Which one of those 2 approaches do you think your company wants to adopt?
All right, let me respond with an even softer softball. I say that ironically. When you look at those current exemplary practices, how far can they really scale? I mean, can I really build an energy neutral or energy positive home in the 60% of the country that's not friendly to wind or solar in the US? Are some of these practices, and so is some of the conversation more about getting people excited by an extreme that we might not implement? And how do you tell the difference between the real steady, sturdy, small step forward, perhaps?
So I'd respond in this way. And there's a reason I use the UK, the home of the Industrial Revolution a couple hundred years ago, as the place that is one of the places where we're seeing some of these efforts change. It's going to take all of us working together to get to where we need to go. It's going to be a combination of smaller local efforts and maybe centrally driven large efforts like we're seeing with the IRA and other policy efforts to drive tax incentives, etc., to move investment. We know how to move investment to where it's needed. That's something we've had hundreds of years of doing very successfully. So it's going to take a combination of large and smaller efforts. The key is our why. And the reason I'm going to go back to our why is climate change doesn't care about politics. It doesn't care whether or not you believe in it. Climate science says it exists. It doesn't care who wins an election, any election. It's going to continue to exert its influence, and it's now heavily a financial influence on individuals. If you try to get an insurance policy in certain states, like the one we're sitting in, there's a material effect. We're talking about dislocating people. There's a material cost. So whatever we can do from a macro perspective or from the perspective of our firms to continue to drive down that carbon footprint or to be better about preserving our environment, regenerative practices, etc., each of us make that impact. Now at scale, I think at events like the ones that we're at here today, where we see our future literally sitting in front of us, it's events like this that will generate the connectivity that we need to drive those big ideas and to have them adopted.
Fair enough. I want to put a question as kind of a jump ball before we go to questions from the floor in a minute. I mentioned in our conversation earlier the Nobel Prize winning economist Lars Peter Hansen. If you don't know his work, check it out. It's really smart. He won the Nobel Prize for kind of mathematical models of risk, but for the last 10 years he's focused all his work in a lab at University of Chicago on quantifying environmental risk, which is really helpful because now we can get closer to doing a profit and loss when we go firm to firm if we understand the dollar and cents of that. And in the room, we had a small number of folks we work with talking with him. And the last question he got was, what's the one thing you, as the world's expert in this, want our firms to do that they're not doing? And he said, I want you to measure the same things in the same ways, right? Which includes, how do you measure carbon footprint? And if you all have been at meetings like this and people say 18% of carbon emissions come from buildings, and then 11% come from transport, but actually some of the 18% was transport in and out of buildings, you wind up with a 300% bubble, right? Because we're all measuring different things different ways. How close are the firms you work with and advise to being on the same standard around sustainability measures?
They're not. They're not. But they want to.
Ah.
They want to.
And is that new?
Yeah, and I think that is fairly new. I mean, people. It's a spectrum. People are at different stages in their sustainability journey, for sure,
Yeah.
right? But they do realize, you have to measure so that you can manage, and then conversations around measurement are all about. Are we measuring the same things, and can we then have the same set of definitions so that we can communicate? And where I see that being very important is particularly around definitions of Scope 3 emissions at a very detailed, granular level so that I can communicate with my supplier to please provide me the most granular set of emissions data, right? And so being able to pull that in from suppliers and to be able to do it in digital ways, right? That's where we get some traction with clients because they want to be able to influence that supply chain because the supplier's Scope 1 and Scope 2 is their Scope 3. And so there is a tie purposely, according to Greenhouse Gas Protocol, for positive peer pressure for everyone to reduce, right? And that's good. We double count in one sense, but we also create positive social mechanisms to drive collaboration. And that's very powerful. I don't know that that's talked enough about in terms of Greenhouse Gas Protocol. But that's the reason why it was organized the way it was, to create action, so that we don't just report all the time and say we're done and celebrate, but that we're actually changing the nature of how we think about sustainability, right? And I joke with people that sustainability is a first goal, not an end goal. Think about that for a minute. It's a first goal, not an end goal. If you were to ask me, I've been married 32 years. If you were to ask me, Japin, how's your marriage? And I were to tell you, well, it's sustainable. What would the follow-on comment? Hollis, you probably ought to go seek some counseling. You're probably not where you need to be. What do we want? The things that we value, our jobs, the corporations we're in, our families, our relationships, our marriages, we don't want them to be sustainable. That's the minimum. That's the minimum. The problem that we focus so much on sustainability is because it takes so much effort just to get there. But where are we going? We want thriving, right? We want flourishing. We want homes in the UK and the United States, in red states, right, that produce more energy than they use. That's thriving. That's flourishing. That's a new level, right? And what we're seeing is clients starting to connect the dots. Everyone is so focused on record and report. record and report, record and report, record and report. And I'm like, guys, what about acting? What about taking it to the next level? We're just trying to get to sustainable, and we're forgetting that the vision that's going to drive people for a common good, right, is the acting that takes us to flourishing. My 2 cents, sorry. I'll get
that's
off
great.
the soapbox.
Well said. Christian.
That was so great. I don't even know how to add there. But coming more like to the like a little bit like a boring thing in terms of how do we measure, making sure that we measure in the same way, making sure that we account in the same way, right? So I want to make the comparison which I made earlier, right, with financials again, right? So there's no question in the financial side that I can compare the numbers of company A with company B, right? Everyone has agreed on a certain standard. Everyone knows how to calculate their revenue, their expenses. So that's a great framework. That's where we have to go come with sustainability again, and we have to basically come to a common framework in the same way than we do financials, right? With the same governance, same accuracy as I alluded earlier, but also on the same structures, because ultimately, there's a cost associated with that, and I need to know, need to make decisions whether I buy something here or there. Is it more expensive? Yes, but maybe the carbon footprint is lower, right? So what is my cost of goods sold? What is my carbon of goods sold, right? So I want to have these same kind of measures which I have on the financial side. I also want to have them with the carbon. So that means I have to really move the financial world and the carbon world together from a reporting perspective, being able to report on the same side, being able to define budgets on the carbon. Just think about a budget on travel, right? All of us probably have a travel budget, right? So what happens if we don't have money anymore? We cannot travel. So what happens if I also have a carbon budget on travel? And then how do we react if we still have money but no carbon budget left? Do we still travel or not? So these kind of things will drive change, and that's kind of where we have to get to.
Great. Brian, any final thoughts on this?
So the one thing I would say as a plug for systems, because I think back to systems and data is so important. As everyone knows that if you can't measure it, you can't fix it. So I think being able to measure in the same ways that we measure the financial flows, being able to measure carbon flows across our enterprise to understand where the opportunities are and maybe aren't is critical, because that helps our plan. I'll go back to the CSRD double materiality assessment because it's so important. And what does double materiality mean? It does two things. It looks at your company's impact on the environment, and then it looks at the environment's impact on your company. Those are two completely different perspectives, but both critical for the future viability of your operations. And by looking at both of those sets of impacts and opportunities, you're then able to drive, along with your risk framework, where you should be spending your time, energy, and money, resources to mitigate risks and to maximize opportunities. Because this challenge, this sustainability challenge, is a massive opportunity for new business models, for growth, top and bottom line growth. We're seeing companies already beginning to experience those impacts. And so it's really, really important that our company's sustainability strategies take that into account, to get beyond the reporting only mindset and to get to the business value perspective that there always is. Since the Industrial Revolution began, the silent stakeholder in mankind's success has been our planet. And it hasn't asked us for very much. But now it's beginning to clear its throat and make its voice heard. And from a very human perspective, who can only really use systems to accurately measure and understand the impact that we are having and the impact that we can have, we should really pay attention. Because as long as that silent stakeholder stays healthy, so do we. It doesn't happen the other way around. And so while that's kind of a broader general call, there is a way to use our current systems to measure our carbon activities, to understand the impact our operations are having, again, so that we can operate in a very circular way. We can think about biodiversity and all those other aspects of life that we depend on outside of the office. And to be able to understand where we sit as companies and what our next step should be and can be, and then to be able to use the data that is being collected by regulatory agencies to benchmark our performance against our peers and others to see, are we really doing as well as we can, or are there learnings we can get from others? And that is collectively how we move at scale to solve the problem.
It's very well said. It's a great note to end this section of our conversation on. And it reminds me of a conversation I had about 20 years ago with an evolutionary geologist named Lynn Margulies, wonderful woman. By the way, first wife of Carl Sagan, if you remember that Cosmos series, mother of Dorian Sagan, interesting writer and all this stuff. I just frankly said, Lynn, how worried 20 years ago should I and we be about climate change? And she said, well, don't worry about the Earth. The Earth is great at self-healing. It's going to be fine. Worry about the impact on people. That's the real fragility. And I would add today, maybe we also worry about the impact on corporations, governments, and other large organizations. Now, 2 of you in this audience said you're doing awesome around sustainability data. Are you willing to come out and reveal who you are? You don't have to, but I'm really curious. We need the Jeopardy music. Yes?
But I'm just happy to share. I'm Jen Thompson. I'm with Oracle.
Here, why don't you take this?
Yeah, sure. I'm a little talker, so I appreciate that. Hi, so I'm Jen Thompson. I work with Oracle. I'm on the sustainability. It's sensitive. I'm on the sustainability applications team. We just launched a Fusion product that, I heard all the buzzwords. It mirrors the financial rigor. It gets down to the granular level. It'll lift data from accounts payable, invoices. We can have suppliers give us their specific emission factors, and you can rank them and say, we always want to use these specific ones, so that you get the most accurate calculations all the time. So we're working on not creating products, but creating sustainability solutions to solve problems. And I think that requires collaboration. It requires everyone to share what information they have. I wouldn't say that we're doing amazing, but I think that we're getting there. We're trying to really help the market and customers.
Can I ask you, in getting to the level that you're at, were there 1 or 2 hard decisions? Thank you.
Hard decisions. I don't know, because I'm fairly newer in this space, so I wasn't there for all of the going through hell, so to speak. But I know that, like all of us, we're living in a universe of spreadsheets and data that's sort of all over the place, and then trying to figure out how to pull that in to get all of your information in one place has been, I think, one of the biggest challenges. And instead of siloing and saying we're only going to read Oracle's applications and nothing else, so you have to buy our product to be able to get this level of granular data, we're saying, you know what? Give us everything that you have. Give us your spreadsheets, give us all of your other applications that you're running, feed data into our system from everything, because we think that's the way to solve the problem, instead of saying, no, you just have to buy our product. So that's what I mean when I said earlier, we're trying to sell a solution to a problem. We're not just selling product for the sake of selling product.
Great. Thank you very much. Who else has a question or a comment? I can bring you the mic, yes, sir.
Well, I want to say thank you to the panel. Some really great points. I had a question around, we use a lot of analogies around financial and ESG reporting. And as we know, in financial reporting, there is what we call creative accounting, and interesting opinions that get formed on things that feel like they should be standardized. So, what is your sort of response to some of the creative accounting practices that could occur or may occur in sustainability reporting? And how do we tackle those? Because it comes back to that sort of comparability perspective of true transparency versus pseudo transparency?
Good, great question.
Yeah, agreed. So the best we have right now for corporations is third-party, independent validation verification. That's how we know when a company issues its financial report, we can trust it or not. So when that level of rigor is now being applied to sustainability reporting, which it is, the CSRD requires, shortly after that, you go from basic compliance to having it assured, reasonable assurance being written into that law, which means the folks who typically help you do the implementation, they can't audit their own work. There needs to be an independent third-party auditor to look at your numbers, look at your systems, looks at your controls, and then offers an opinion, which their reputation sits on, that this is accurate and complete. I think that's as well as we can do to begin to drive folks to being transparent and to having the standardized systems and that we need to actually trust what folks are doing. And it's one of the things that drove kind of the regulatory authorities to move from let's do some of that feel-good reporting, let's talk about some of the things you're doing in the community, to these 1,180 metrics that is now being required, at least by the CSRD. So we've gone from, the pendulum has swung. It's going to take companies time to catch up, to understand that this is something they want to do. Maybe companies don't want to do business in the EU. They don't want to do business in Europe, so it may not matter. But that goes back to the why. If whether or not your company does business in the EU where the CSRD has requirements, what is your why? What is your stance on sustainability? How do your stakeholders, how do your financiers feel about that? How do your employees feel about it? How do your customers feel about it? That still needs to be considered. So I believe we're headed on the right track by requiring the same levels of transparency that we have on the financial side as well.
I would, well said. I'm no accountant by purpose, right? I didn't, but I have taken a couple accounting courses, and I'm interested in how we throw that term around, right? We throw around, a greenhouse gas protocol talks about that they do carbon accounting. No, not debits and credits, right? It's carbon counting, right? It's inventories. But what I heard your question was true accounting. So we need to understand the definitions, right? Greenhouse gas puts together an inventory that, oh, by the way, it has some really great attributes. We talked about the positive peer pressure, right? But it also has some significant limitations. Because it does double counting, it doesn't align itself with debits and credits, right? It doesn't. Now, there are some emerging technologies that do, right? Or we'll call them, you guys know Robert Kaplan, who did balanced scorecarding, the Harvard Business professor. He came out with E-Liability Institute. How many of you know about E-Liability Institute? Okay, check it out. E-liabilityinstitute.com. An amazing article in Harvard Business Review from him and another professor out of Oxford that in essence say the future is to have green ledgers where we can actually count the carbon like you count cash, with debits and credits at the transaction level, right? Now, there are critics that I talk to, particularly at some oil and gas companies that I know, say, hey, look, how can you go do accounting, true debits and credits, counting carbon like you would count cash? How can you do that, SAP, right? Because we've got a product that's coming out in December that does that. It starts to do that, okay? How can you do that if, unless you're using, unless you have standards, right? Like for US GAAP, right? We don't have those. We don't have carbon accounting standards, right? Well, people were doing double entry bookkeeping for hundreds of years before GAAP, right? And accounting is a practice guided by theory, right? So my belief is that what will happen is that we will foray into the art of practice with our clients, what works, what doesn't, and we have this US GAAP and IFRS rules that will guide the practice of operating carbon accounting. And what you will see is our ability to truly count carbon like you count cash, and we will morph it as we learn, right? That's how humans operate. We get better, right? And so I think the creativity, you will see a lot of it there as the accountants determine not only are we going to create counting of inventory and emissions, but we're going to sync it back and we'll know exactly, we'll have carbon budgets like Christian talked about, right? In ways that will be very meaningful for us to take action, right? Remember, how many people have enormous sustainability teams in your companies? Like 50, 100 people. Anybody got that? No, like 2, like 5, right? It's a handful. So you have to, as an organization, be a force multiplier. Within you as a team, as a sustainability team, have got to go get like-minded individuals acting on sustainability so that the procurement people and the planners and the schedulers are out there evaluating emissions data that you've provided to them because you've got an ERP system that calculated it and put it back in a material master and sent it out and infused it throughout the business process so sustainability is embedded and they can act. So a planner and scheduler can say, while I'm evaluating cost of supply, availability of supply, price of supply, now I can evaluate my supplier on their emissions. And it's embedded in my workflow. That's how we get to act. That's the power, and we're so glad that Oracle is entering that marketplace because we were alone for a long time, right? And so that's important, right? That others start to use that ERP data, right, to drive change because we won't ever get to act. We won't even get to creative accounting if we can't use data in business process.
Can I mention?
Please.
Can I mention a quick point on that, just from a business process perspective? Small thing, but it is kind of emblematic of the change that needs to happen in corporations. We have some of our clients here who who hopefully pay their bills every month. Let's use a utility bill. They pay their utility bills every month for their buildings, their manufacturing facilities, etc. Most of them use a third party to gather that information. Yet when it's time to figure out to do your reporting, for regulatory reporting, you need kilowatt hours on electricity used. And guess what you do? You ask individuals, you ask your third-party processor to go back over those same bills and pull the kilowatt hours. Those same bills you paid every month, on time. So, because it wasn't being looked at from a sustainability perspective, it was being seen from an accounts payable perspective. So think of how many activities which are not kind of thought of as being sustainability activities in your company that really are. They all are, to be honest with you. From R&D through to shipping, they all have sustainability components. So can you imagine if when you captured your accounts payable bill, you also captured the kilowatt hours which speciated the exact of your greenhouse gases that so all of a sudden you don't need to pull a team together to do that. There are multiple opportunities to begin to converge business processes and operationalize the gathering of sustainability data so it's not a project at the end of the year.
Great. Quick. Yeah.
Yeah, very quick comment on the question you had, right?
Yes.
So I mean, even on the financial side, which is like hundreds of years old, right? We have evolved. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a Sarbanes-Oxley Act, right? So, and the same thing will happen on sustainability,
Absolutely.
right? We talk about internally a SOXification of sustainability, right? So these regulations will evolve and will put more rigor onto the process, onto the data, so that they are also more comparable. Earlier we talked about fashion, right? And taking this example, a lot of fashion companies or some fashion companies have been accused of greenwashing. Now the EU is looking into a green labeling directive, which really requires company to put data behind it, so that it can be proven that you have a certain amount of recycled material in your clothing or organic material and things like that. So we will see
Fascinating.
this evolving.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all attuned to the risk side of this. How did we get Sarbanes-Oxley? Economic disaster, followed by Sarbanes-Oxley. How do we get to the next big landmark around decarbonization and sustainability standards? I think all of us in this room are in the business of trying to make sure we don't have the ecological disaster to make that happen. I can tell you, we started doing work in this sphere about 2.5 years ago. At that point, all the big accounting firms were spending a lot of money to understand, to do thought leadership around sustainability and decarbonization, because they saw the Scope 3 mandatory requirements coming soon, and they want to own that audit space, right? They want to charge a lot of money for the financial audit. They want to charge a lot of money for the environmental audit, for the Scope 3 audit. It's about a year ago the chairman of the SEC announced, to many people's surprise, that they were going to pull back on the mandatory Scope 3 reporting, because the process there, it's not a law, it's a rule. All the prep work had been done in terms of soliciting comment, putting out different drafts. It was not much more than the flip of a switch. And the consensus was that appointed political and administrative leader is waiting until November. And here we are. We're less than a week away. This is the third rail topic for a conversation like this. We've managed to avoid talking about politics, which is largely a good thing, but I think we all know that's hovering in the background. Part of what we discussed in the pregame conversation was it matters a great deal in terms of rhetoric, but there are unstoppable points of necessity. There are things in motion that no one's going to be able to stop. And I think the harm that politics has done has been more of too much holding your breath, too much pausing. And we will probably see, regardless of who wins and regardless of the rhetoric, a lot of change and most likely some real progress continuing when we hit 2025. Having said that, we have time for one more question or comment. No, we don't. We don't. All right, raise your hand if you're an optimist about these issues. Good enough. And shoot that QR code. You've got pieces of paper in front of you. You'll get a really substantial report from some of these folks and the host of the conference. They will ask you for your name and contact info, so that's up to you. Thank you all for being a great audience, and thank the panel for a really great conversation. And thank you, Dania, for all your help.